Former President Donald Trump is indicted. A Wall Street Journal reporter is detained in Russia on phony espionage charges, and Egypt and Syria pursue closer ties. This is the noteworthy news that you need to know for Monday, April 3rd, 2023. Before we get to that, you know the drill. Please like, comment, and subscribe to this channel. Also, please follow me on social media, i.e. Instagram and Twitter, at Julie R. Hartman. And also, please be sure to check out my show Timeless, where I talk about timeless, eternal subjects. Tomorrow, there's going to be this great episode coming out where I interview Professor Avi Loeb, who is head of astronomy at Harvard University, and he was named by Time magazine as one of the top 25 most influential people in the space world. So again, please do check that out. On to the first news story of the day. Of course, it's been the talk of the town. Our former president, Donald Trump, has been indicted. The DA, District Attorney of Manhattan, Alvin Bragg, convened a grand jury which voted to indict former President Donald Trump over hush money payments that he paid to porn star Stormy Daniels. This whole thing is so tawdry. I mean, it's really just so unfortunate. Donald Trump and Melania Trump got married in 2005, and then the alleged affair between Donald Trump and Stormy Daniels commenced in 2006. Donald wasn't even married to Melania for a year, and he was already cheating. Also, 2006 was the year that Barron Trump was born. I mean, the whole thing is just so sad for their family. And of course, it is morally wrong, but that is a very different question than whether or not it is legally wrong. And so right now we're going to be talking about the legal facts, because obviously that is what is first and foremost here. When President Donald Trump became a candidate back in 2015 for President of the United States, Stormy Daniels sort of sniffed out an extortion opportunity. So she began to demand money in exchange for silence. Allegedly, Stormy Daniels, over the previous decade, since that 2006 affair, had repeatedly asked Donald Trump for payments, but of course, this was one of the most consequential career moves of his life. So the Trump Organization sent $130,000 to Daniels through Trump's personal lawyer, Michael Cohen. This expense was recorded on the company books as legal fees. And so this is the whole, basis of the indictment. The indictment alleges that this is a falsification of business records. And you know what? It seems, according to the facts that we have now, that it probably is. It was not a legal fee to pay off Stormy Daniels. It was a hush money fee. But under New York law, this is a misdemeanor. So in order to kick it up to a felony indictment, this is according to the Wall Street Journal editorial writer Bradley Smith, the DA of Manhattan, Alvin Bragg, had to show that the falsification was designed to conceal another crime. So here's where the mental gymnastics of this indictment comes in. Bragg has said that the crime here is campaign finance violation, and it is illegal for a corporation to contribute to a presidential campaign, hence what this whole indictment is about. The Federal Election Campaign Act says that a contribution is any donation made, quote, for the purpose of influencing any campaign for the federal office. So again, just to make it very clear, Bragg is saying that the Trump Organization made a campaign contribution by paying off Stormy Daniels. Again, according to this act, a contribution is anything that is with the purpose of influencing any campaign for the federal office. And given that the Trump Organization is a corporation, it is illegal for a corporation to give money to a federal election campaign. So with those facts, it seems like the indictment is legitimate, right? Not so fast. The Supreme Court has established an objective standard for what it means to influence any federal election. That statute's line there, that any contribution is for the purpose of influencing any federal election, that is extremely vague. When you read that, you don't know exactly what it constitutes. So both the statute and the U.S. Supreme Court have established specific guidelines in order to interpret what that means. And here is the really important part that shows that this is not a crime, as the DA of Manhattan, Alvin Bragg, is alleging. The statute holds that expenses that you would have incurred anyway, even if you weren't running for office, do not qualify as campaign expenses. So let's give an example here. If a presidential candidate buys an expensive suit to wear to a debate, for instance, that doesn't count as a campaign expense because a person would need to be clothed anyway. Even though maybe that guy wouldn't have purchased the expensive suit had he been running for office, clothes do not count as a campaign expense because, again, you need clothes in everyday life. Now, if you are traveling on the campaign trail and you are staying at a hotel, that counts as a campaign expense because you wouldn't have otherwise been traveling had you not been running for office. But your meals during that trip do not count as a campaign expense because you need to eat. So the argument here is that Trump paid off Stormy Daniels not solely for the purpose of influencing his campaign. There were other personal purposes for which he paid off Stormy Daniels, namely that he wanted to spare his wife and son from the public embarrassment, and also he wanted to keep up a lucrative TV career. So again, what's really important here is that the statute holds what the statute holds is that if you have a personal purpose besides a campaign purpose for spending money, then that does not count as something that was intended to benefit your campaign. So that shows here, because Trump had another purpose for paying off this porn star, it doesn't count as a campaign contribution, and that means that the Trump organization wasn't making a campaign contribution, and the indictment is null. What's also really important to consider here, and this is again what the Wall Street Journal op-ed writer, who I thought explained this so well, Bradley Smith, argued, is that let's say Trump used his campaign funds instead of Trump organization funds to pay off Stormy Daniels. Then the DA, Alvin Bragg, would be alleging that Trump illegally used campaign funds for personal use. So as Bradley Smith puts it, quote, "This is a classic catch-22 that undermines the rule of law." Either way, they would serve up this indictment because now they're doing this mental gymnastics to claim that he made an unlawful campaign contribution. And then if he used campaign funds, they would be saying that he did it for personal use. So either way, he was screwed, which shows that this is political persecution rather than something that is actually rooted in the law. We often hear in our country that no one is above the law, and that is certainly true. But no one is beneath it either, meaning that someone shouldn't be selectively prosecuted or should have a especially harsh interpretation of the law being applied to them. And that is what we are seeing here with our former president, whether or not you agree with him. This is clear as day political persecution. And we see that this has been not uncommon in this country over the past few years. That is, the government persecuting those for political reasons. I've talked on this show about Mark Houck, who is a pro-life father who a few months ago was praying in front of an abortion clinic, which apparently is a violation of a federal law to pray in front of an abortion clinic. And the Department of Justice sent a 25-member SWAT team to his home to arrest him. Is that really worth sending a 25-member SWAT team to this guy's home for praying in front of an abortion clinic? A lot of people trespass on land and they are not, no sort of legal recourse even happens. And if legal recourse does happen, they get a letter or they get a notification or they are arrested by one person and they have to show up in court. When you send a 25-member SWAT team to someone's house, that usually has been for extremely violent, dangerous criminals, not for a guy who is pro-life and praying in front of an abortion clinic with his son. That is one example. Another example I reported on as recently as last week, the IRS made an unannounced home visit to the residence of Matt Taibbi, who was one of the journalists that Elon Musk enlisted to expose the Twitter files. And the IRS agent made this unannounced visit to his home the same day that Mr. Taibbi was testifying before the U.S. Congress about weaponization of the federal government. Coincidence? I don't know. Seems kind of shady if you ask me. And of course, the Twitter files, which Matt Taibbi, as I just said, was in charge of exposing, shows the extent of political persecution that is now undertaken by our federal government, where the FBI made a $3.4 million wire transfer to Twitter. They were meeting with Twitter execs on a weekly basis in order to suppress conservative content. The former FBI General Counsel, James Baker, went on to work at Twitter, and he was single-handedly in charge of squashing the Hunter Biden story in October of 2020, just 3 weeks before the election. So if you were really trying to establish a sense of trust among the American people in the rule of law, that it is interpreted objectively and that it is applied equally to everyone, regardless of how certain officials feel politically, then this Trump indictment is doing the very opposite, and it is a very sad thing for our country. It is also, sadly, extremely emblematic of our era. We live in a time where a lot of people, specifically legal scholars, think that you can just read anything you want into a statute. This is the whole living Constitution approach, that the Constitution is a living, breathing document that can evolve with the times. This sounds great in theory, but in practice, it allows for a lot of abuses of power. By the way, I'm talking about the living Constitution approach, which specifically pertains to constitutional jurisprudence, but this is the same for all kinds of statutes. We have people in charge who think that they can just read in whatever they want, to interpret it and bend it to their favor, which is what we're seeing here with, as I said, this extreme mental legal gymnastics about this hush money supposedly constituting an illegal campaign contribution. It's very, very sad, and it shows you that undermining the truth in small ways is just so dangerous. We live in a time where people do not put a premium on clarity and on truth. They put a premium on lies. And again, distorting facts to fit whatever kind of narrative you want. Even recently, I reported that President Obama was in Australia, and he was talking about how President Trump is in charge for the ascension of China that we see today. Do you understand what a lie that is? President Trump, whether you like him or not, was extremely strong pertaining to China. It has been President Joe Biden who has dismissed the threat of China, who is indeed, according to what has been exposed with the Hunter Biden laptop story, bought off by China. And it's just another example of people can just say whatever they want, and it is deemed as truth. And so we have to really take a look at ourselves as a country and see that in everyday lives, undermining the truth adds up. President Trump's court appearance apparently is scheduled for 2:15 Eastern time tomorrow. There is likely going to be a mugshot coming out of that, which is going to be put on t-shirts and posters. It's going to be used by the left to say that Donald Trump is a criminal, and is going to be used by the right to say that he is unfairly politically persecuted. Donald Trump is expected to fly from Florida to New York City today and spend the night in Trump Tower before mugshot day, which is tomorrow. Of course, on this show, we will continue to keep you updated as these events unfold. Now, on to another really sad news. Evan Gershkovich, who is a journalist with the Wall Street Journal's Moscow bureau, was detained last week in Russia on phony espionage charges. This is the first time that Russia has brought a spy case against an overseas reporter since the Cold War. Here are the facts of the story. Mr. Gershkovich was last in contact with Americans on Wednesday when he was in the Ural Mountains in Russia on a reporting mission, and he was actually having dinner at a steakhouse. And then the Wall Street Journal reporters that work with him in the States started to see reports on Telegram, which is a Russian messaging service, that FSB security agents had taken a patron at a diner at a steakhouse with his hood up and detained him. So of course they started panicking. They speculated rightly that it was Mr. Gershkovich, and indeed it was. On Thursday morning, Russia's state news agency said that the FSB, which by the way is the Federal Security Bureau, it is the thug security force of Russia. It's the successor to the Soviet era KGB. The Russian state news agency said that the FSB said that Mr. Gershkovich had been detained and accused of espionage, okay? Espionage charges carry a possible sentence of up to 20 years in prison, and espionage trials in Russia are notoriously clandestine and secretive, and they almost always, like 97 or 98% of the time, end up in a conviction. Mr. Gershkovich is now being held in the FSB Lefortovo prison, which is known for just being awful to prisoners. I mean, what prison in Russia isn't awful to its prisoners? Gershkovich, as I said, has been a Wall Street Journal Moscow reporter for years, and he was actually, interestingly, accredited with the Russian Foreign Ministry, and he has lived in Moscow for several years. Throughout his life, according to the Wall Street Journal, he was fascinated by Russia. He is actually the son of Jews who fled the Soviet Union. Both his mother and father indeed fled the Soviet Union, and he is the grandson of a Holocaust survivor. This detainment of Mr. Gershkovich could be related to something that happened last week, where a Russian national here in the U.S. was charged in a U.S. district court in Washington, D.C. with acting as an agent of a foreign power. He was charged with visa fraud, bank fraud, and wire fraud, among other things. So this, of course, could be Russia retaliating against this charge against a Russian national. What's at stake here with Mr. Gershkovich being detained is really, really interesting. And looking at what is at stake requires a bit of a history of Americans being detained in Russia. We all know that Brittany Griner, who is a female basketball star here in the United States, was detained in Russia just a few days before Putin invaded Ukraine in February of 2022. She was charged or convicted of drug smuggling and possession because she was carrying hashish oil in her luggage, which is a cannabis product, and cannabis is strictly illegal and prohibited in Russia. She was sentenced to 9 years in a penal colony, and then in December of 2022, as I'm sure many of us remember, President Biden released convicted Russian international arms trafficker Viktor Bout in exchange for Brittany Griner. Viktor Bout was this awful human being. He's nicknamed the Merchant of Death. There is a Nicolas Cage movie about him, and he is notorious for delivering arms all over the world, Soviet-era arms that he took when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. And he especially sold arms to various resistance groups in Africa, which created a lot of problems and civil wars in that continent. A former chief of operations for the Drug Enforcement Agency here in the United States, in a 60 Minutes story, called Viktor Bout, quote, one of the most dangerous men on the face of the earth. So Griner was exchanged for Bout. But there was someone very important who was left behind, and this is what brings us to this Gershkovich story. A Marine veteran, Paul Whelan. He was in custody in Russia for 4 years on charges of spying on behalf of the United States. Now, as I told you at the start of this story, this Gershkovich story is the first time that an espionage or a spying charge has been brought against an overseas journalist since the Cold War. Paul Whelan, this veteran, has also been in custody on espionage charges, but he is not a journalist. He was a Marine veteran, again, traveling in the region. So what's so interesting about this story is just how unfair it was that Brittany Griner was swapped for Viktor Bout and not Paul Whelan. Because A, Paul Whelan had been in Russia for longer. He had been there for 4 years. Brittany Griner had only been there, only, of course, any time in Russia is awful, but compared to Whelan, she had only been there for 9 months. So it would have been much more fair for Whelan to be swapped first because he was there longer, A. B, crucially, Whelan did not commit the crime that he was convicted of in Russia. They accused him of espionage. Both he and the United States have held that he did not commit this espionage. There was no evidence that he was committing espionage. Whereas Brittany Griner, whether or not you think it was, right or wrong, under Russian law, it is illegal to possess cannabis items. She did break the law of a foreign country. I remember my senior year of college, we took a trip to Israel, one of the best experiences of my life, as I'm sure those of you who watch me know, because I talk about it all the time. And we flew from Boston to Istanbul, Turkey, and then took a connecting flight from Istanbul to Tel Aviv. And the leaders of the trip told us repeatedly, do not take weed items, edibles, joints, vapes, anything. Do not put it in your luggage. Don't even think about trying to bring it on the trip. Because when you land in Istanbul, they're going to know, they're going to screen for that, they're going to know that you have it, and you will be detained. It is against Turkish law to have cannabis items. This is not uncommon for many countries around the world. So again, we can talk about how awful it is that Russia has these laws, but the fact is, Brittany Griner did violate Russian law, unlike Paul Whelan. So A, because he had been there for longer, and B, because he did not commit the crime, Paul Whelan should have been exchanged first. And also, he was a veteran, whereas Brittany Griner was someone who really hated the United States, would talk a lot about how systemically racist and oppressive the U.S. is. So, all things being equal, isn't it probably better to take the veteran, someone who actually served our country, versus someone who hates it? Anyway, that is the facts of that story. And bringing this back to Gershkovich, Whelan and Gershkovich have been detained in Russia for the exact same charge, espionage. So really, there is no good reason going forward, if there is going to be a criminal swap, which is probably what is going to happen, to free Gershkovich. There is really no good reason for President Biden to trade Gershkovich first over Whelan. They're there for the same charge, and Whelan was there for longer, and he was passed over because Brittany Griner was traded first. So it will be really, really interesting to see what President Biden chooses to do here if there is a prison swap that comes up. One signal feature of the American character that we have to keep in mind here has been our finely tuned sense of fairness. That is what is coming to play here with a possible prison swap. I'd like to tell you an example that all Americans should know pertaining to the late Senator John McCain of Arizona. He served in the Vietnam War, and his plane was shot down in 1967 over North Vietnam, and then he served 6 years in Hanoi as a prisoner of war under torture and constant duress. He was at the Hanoi Hilton, which is the infamous, terrible prisoner of war camp in Hanoi. And the North Vietnamese who ran that camp repeatedly offered John McCain release because they sensed a propaganda opportunity. John McCain was the son and grandson of admirals. His father was actually commander-in-chief of the U.S. forces in the Pacific during World War II. And so the North Vietnamese offered him release because then they could paint John McCain, and by extension Americans, as, indulgent or selfish and not standing on principle and easily being swapped. But John McCain realized this, and to his enormous credit, he refused, despite the fact that when his plane was shot down, he broke both arms and a leg. Multiple times a day in the prison, he was beat. He was not treated properly for his injuries, but he insisted that the other POWs be released alongside him, or he would not be released. He understood fairness. I'll give you another example that doesn't pertain to America, but it is the same American sensibility of fairness that we used to have and increasingly don't have. It's with regard to the raid on Entebbe, which of course happened in 1976. For those of you who don't know about this, read the first chapter of the new biography on Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel. This is an amazing story. There was a flight from Tel Aviv to Paris, which obviously had a lot of Jews, a lot of Israelis on the flight, and it was hijacked by pro-Palestinian terrorists, and it was flown to Entebbe, Uganda. The terrorists were seeking release of 53 of their comrades who were in prison in Israel, so they were holding Jews, Israelis on the plane in order to try to strike a deal with the Israeli government to release their prisoners. And so after the flight landed in Uganda, the terrorists separated the passengers into Jews and non-Jews. And they allowed the non-Jews to be released, including 12 members of the Air France crew, the pilots and the flight attendants who were on board, who were not Jews. And again, to their enormous credit, those 12 members of the Air France crew did not accept the offer to leave. They insisted on staying with the Israelis who were kept at that Entebbe airport in Uganda until they were released. They understood fairness. And by the way, again, amazing story, this raid on Entebbe. The Israeli government in the nighttime flew planes to Uganda, rescued every single one of those passengers. Netanyahu's brother was one of the members of the IDF who flew on the plane to help liberate these people who were captured. And unfortunately, Netanyahu's brother was the one Israeli who died during this mission. But again, this principle of fairness is so important here. And of course, it was a great thing that Brittany Griner got to come home. It was an early Christmas present for all Americans. It would be a wonderful thing if Gershkovich could come home, of course. But we can't forget about Paul Whelan, who has been passed over many times, who is still in Russia. We have to abide by that sense of fairness. The Griner situation indicated that President Biden does not understand that principle of fairness. The Gershkovich situation we have yet to see. And into the final news story of the day, Egypt and Syria are in advanced talks to restore diplomatic relations. This is a big deal, and spoiler alert, I'm going to tell you why now. So Egypt and Syria are again in these advanced talks as a Syrian foreign minister met with an Egyptian foreign minister in Cairo. This is the first public visit by a top Syrian official to Egypt since 2011 during the start of the civil war in Syria. And of course, that was the same year as the Arab Spring uprisings. It has been reported, it is unconfirmed, but nevertheless, there's large speculation that the presidents of Syria and Egypt are going to meet at the end of Ramadan later this month. This is, of course, the Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi would meet with the president of Syria, Bashar al-Assad. So why is this such a big deal that Egypt and Syria are thawing tensions? Well, as I mentioned, they haven't met since 2011, which was an incredibly consequential year, not just for Syria, but for all of the Middle East. And that was the year of the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring was a series of uprisings across the Middle East against the dictatorial governments, which of course persecute citizens all across that region. And it started because President Obama flew to Cairo and gave a very inspiring speech about the need for democracy in the Middle East. But he indicated in that speech that the United States would come to the aid of Middle Easterners who would rise up against their governments. So all across the Middle East, people did this, literally like in almost every single country. But unfortunately, the United States did not come to the aid of these people who were rising up. And this was most on display in 2011 in Syria, where people who opposed the president of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, and his dictatorial regime rose up against him, which in turn caused just horrible, horrible fighting. Bashar al-Assad used chemical weapons against his own people. He also did these sieges called starve or surrender sieges, where he would starve people who opposed him, unless, of course, they surrendered. And he was aided by Russia and by Iran, who helped Bashar al-Assad with airstrikes. The Syrian civil war actually hasn't ended 12 years later. It is technically still ongoing, but it appears that Bashar al-Assad, because he's been able to remain in power so far, is prevailing and will prevail in the future. The Assad family is Alawite, which is a sect of Shia Islam. And by the way, I have to do a little bit of a promo here. On my Timeless episodes last week, I did one on Islam 101, and I talked about some of the divides between Sunnis and Shias. It is a very, very big deal in the Muslim world, that sectarian divide. People compare it to the divide between Protestants and Catholics, but it is far more of a big deal than that. There are many differences between the Sunnis and the Shias, namely that they trace different successors to the Prophet Muhammad. They also have different rules pertaining to marriage, pertaining to interpretation of the Quran. The point is that sectarian divide is very, very, very strong and plays a big role in the Middle East. So the Assad regime is Alawite, which again is a Shia, part of the Shia sect of Islam. And that is why countries like Egypt and a lot of Arab countries in the Middle East have opposed Syria, because Egypt and those other Arab countries are Sunni. 90% of the Muslim world are Sunnis and only 10% are Shias. So that's why it is so incredible that Egypt and Syria are thawing relations, because Egypt is Sunni, Syria is led by Alawites, which are Shia, and historically meaning over the past 12 years, all of the Sunni Arab countries have been staunchly opposed to Bashar al-Assad and have sided indeed with the people who have been rebelling against him. But again, now that it is clear that Assad is going to stay in power, 12 years later he still is, there are these efforts made by Arab countries to kind of bring him back into the fold, mainly because they want trade benefits with Syria. During this meeting between the two foreign ministers of Syria and Egypt, they apparently discussed Syria's possible return to the Arab League, which is a group of 22 nations, which in 2011 kicked Syria out of their league, but they are now thinking about bringing Syria back in. And also several Arab nations, including Egypt, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan, delivered aid after the devastating earthquake that happened in Syria and Turkey back in February. In addition, Bashar al-Assad has visited Oman and the UAE, two Arab Sunni countries, in recent months as these tensions are thawing. Saudi Arabia and Syria are also nearing an agreement to reestablish diplomatic ties after negotiations which were mediated by Russia. And we know that recently Saudi Arabia and Iran established ties thanks to China. Saudi Arabia, as I said, is a Sunni country, and Iran is one of the few countries, like Syria, that is run by Shias. So if we can just zoom out here, what's really important, if there's one thing I want you to take away from this story, it is the fact that our adversaries in the Middle East are becoming closer to one another. And not just that they are becoming closer to one another, but the mechanism through which they are becoming closer to one another is through our other adversaries who are helping unite them. Russia negotiated this deal between Saudi Arabia and Syria, and China negotiated a deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran. We, the United States, for most of our history, we were the power that helped thaw relations throughout the world. And now we are being replaced, and our adversaries are becoming closer to one another against us. On that happy note, I hope you have a great rest of the day. Please, again, be sure to subscribe to this channel. Follow me at Julie R. Hartman, and we'll be bringing you more news soon. Take care.